Okay, welcome to another episode of Talk Lex. I'm Scott Peterson. Joanna is here with me today. Just a reminder, Talk Lex is brought to you by DeRazio Peterson. So if you have any legal questions, feel free to reach out to us or visit our website, DeRazioPeterson.com, or check out our Instagram and hit us up with a message there. Also, if you enjoy the Talk Lex podcast, please feel free to subscribe, like, share, give us a 5-star review. And if you have questions, reach out to us on Instagram at TalkLex Podcast. So here we are today. Lots of, as usual, lots of interesting legal issues in the news. Let's start with a lawsuit involving the hip hop artist ASAP Rocky, who is the father has a child with Rihanna. Is that right?
Two, I think.
Okay, so this is more than I know. Okay. Anyway, ASAP Rocky was on trial for allegedly firing a semi-automatic pistol at a former friend of his, and was this week acquitted in the criminal trial. But he is also involved in a civil lawsuit with the accuser, and that appears to be going on. So I thought we would talk about why it is different when you are involved in a criminal trial versus a civil trial. Some people may know that, some people may not. But long story short, the burden of proof is very different in a criminal trial than it is in a civil trial. So ASAP Rocky was criminally charged with firing a semi-automatic pistol. The burden of proof is on the government in that case, and the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, if any juror had any inkling that he maybe did not do what he was accused of, that could be lead to an acquittal. And that is not, in fact, the case in a civil proceeding. So he is also being sued civilly by the individual who alleges that he pointed the pistol and shot at him. And he's being sued for, among other things, assault and battery. Why don't you kind of get into the standard in a civil proceeding versus a criminal proceeding?
So the standard in a civil proceeding is lower. It's preponderance of the evidence. So the reason to move forward with a civil proceeding, as opposed, even when someone is acquitted in a criminal trial, is you could be compensated theoretically in a civil trial monetarily, which is what it sounds like this guy's looking for. Apparently it came up in the criminal trial that he was asking for like a $30 million settlement. That probably was something that contributed to ASAP Rocky being acquitted, because people don't like that. So yeah, I mean, O.J. Simpson is the most obvious and famous example of someone being acquitted criminally and then being hit with a gigantic verdict in a civil trial. I don't know that will happen here, because I think ASAP Rocky, first of all, I feel like this gun was fake or a toy or something like that. And he seems pretty, he's been very, confident of his innocence. I think he declined a plea deal and, took the risk of going through this trial and was acquitted. So yeah, I mean, the reason to keep moving forward civilly and they could have used a verdict in the criminal case against him in a civil case, but it doesn't sort of work the other way, around because of the different standards. So my understanding is the civil case has been stayed this whole time. And now that the criminal case is over, it will move forward.
Yeah, it's not unusual that first of all, it's not unusual for, in some cases, there to be both criminal cases and civil cases arising out of the same course of conduct. Think about like in a situation where someone is hurt in a car accident and by a drunk driver. It's very often the case that the drunk driver is ticketed, and goes through the criminal process before the civil case proceeds, in part because of what Giovanna said, which is if there's a conviction or a plea of guilty in the criminal proceeding, we can then use that in the civil proceeding to help establish liability against the wrongdoer. So it's not uncommon that you would see people who potentially have civil liability exposure fight more aggressively in the criminal case to avoid exactly that. You know, if he had been convicted, that would have been basically a knockout in his civil case. And so he had a very significant reason to defend himself. So according to the articles, the accuser says it was a real gun and that he felt something warm on his hand after it was shot. ASAP Rocky said it was a prop gun, which fired blank bullets or did not fire actual bullets that could have possibly caused any kind of an injury. So that's kind of interesting.
Did it hit him?
He said it did. Yeah.
Yeah. So just a little aside from that, this is like one of those things you learn in your first year of law school, the difference between assault and battery. Battery is when it actually hits you. Assault is like the fear of it, even though in kind of common terms, we would think of the assault also including actually being hit.
Yeah. They said it shot blanks. So it's interesting. Wow. You know, another interesting observation about this is that the gun apparently came from a video that he shot with Rihanna, who was also in the courtroom while the jury was there and during deliberations. I can't imagine that having Rihanna in the courtroom helped the prosecution. I'm sure, the jury was maybe, there's maybe a little bit of sense of pressure in that scenario. I mean, she's a billionaire, pretty famous musician who sung at the halftime show of the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. So,
yeah, and he like drove out of his seat and like tackled her after he was acquitted.
He did. Well, so he lives to fight another day without prison. Will apparently defend himself. Who knows if this case gets settled? But it seems that he is not rolling over, which brings me to topic number 2. One of your favorite hip hop artists, Jay-Z, involved in a very sort of nasty case with a lawyer out of Texas named Tony Busby. So some background here. Tony Busby represents, according to articles, dozens and dozens of folks who claim that they were either assaulted or involved inappropriately with Jay-Z and Diddy. For those who don't know,
well, mostly Diddy. All his lawsuits
mostly
are arising from this whole P. Diddy fiasco.
Correct. Primarily Diddy. So, and I'll give some more context to that. He is suing Diddy in a number of cases in various jurisdictions around the country. Diddy is currently in prison, awaiting, I guess, trial on several charges. At one point, Busby filed lawsuits or was involved in lawsuits which identified another individual. It was later determined that he was referring to Jay-Z, who adamantly denied any wrongdoing in the cases. And one of the plaintiffs who had apparently pointed the finger at Jay-Z later dismissed that claim. And now Jay-Z and by extension Diddy are kind of trying to turn this around on Tony Busby, the lawyer out of Texas, by accusing him of defamation, as well as unauthorized practice of law, which is kind of an interesting one. We'll get to the defamation case in a second, but the unauthorized practice, basically, their argument is that he was filing papers in one of the federal courts in New York and was not admitted to do so. And when he filed his application to get admitted into that court on what's called a pro hoc vice or by the case admission, it was denied. So just for a little bit of context, he is admitted in New York to practice law. When you're admitted in a state, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are admitted to practice in the federal courts in that state. You have to get admitted into each of them. And apparently he was not. So they are fighting him on that. But the defamation case is the more interesting one, I think. And what do you see here in terms of the allegations against him, and what is actually getting him into trouble? Because I think it's sort of interesting what courts are kind of focusing on when it comes to his actions.
Yeah, so the lawsuit was against P. Diddy, and it was pretty serious and disgusting, like a 13-year-old girl was, or, you know, who's now an adult, but was alleging things that happened when she was 13 years old. So obviously a very serious allegation. Apparently in the first lawsuit, they referred to another celebrity as quote unquote celebrity A. Then all these rumors started that celebrity A was Jay-Z. And a common theme in a lot of our podcasts and things that we talk about just in our practice is social media getting you in trouble. So New York, at least, I don't know what the law is specifically in California, but in New York, there is an absolute privilege for statements that are made in the context of litigation. So attorneys cannot be sued for something that they say in a legal pleading. But they can be sued for defamation for, you know, statements outside of the litigation or pre-litigation statements. And my understanding is that what happened with this attorney is that he started basically acknowledging on social media that this celebrity A was Jay-Z, and ultimately, I think, refiled the lawsuit and actually named him. This month, the lawsuit was, they said it was dismissed. And I think the context of it being dismissed is that it was actually withdrawn. So I don't know if the accuser, there's a million reasons why, you know, that could happen. Doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. I really, you know, we don't really know the circumstances of it. I don't think it's settled or anything like that. It doesn't seem like it. It seems like the lawsuit was just withdrawn. So Jay-Z is now pursuing, you know, a defamation claim against this attorney, based on, you know, it becoming more clear that he was the one who was being accused. And he basically had to out himself as well, because these rumors started. And I think he, you know, by pursuing this, he kind of has acknowledged that, you know, that's who this celebrity A was referring to. So there's like a little risk in that as well.
Yeah, there's a number of kind of interesting points in this. The social media posts, apparently he was just liking, or at least one of the judges referenced the fact that he was liking posts that identified Jay-Z as the individual. So, you know, it's interesting how much into the minutia they can get when they're determining your social media activity, and how much, you know, the little things can implicate you. And you see it all the time that people get called out for, you know, liking or following or engaging with content that, you know, people find to be upsetting or, you know, problematic. So that was kind of it's kind of an interesting, you know, sort of approach to it. I don't know. What do you think of this? This is challenging, and it's challenging because, like you said, just because the lawsuit's withdrawn, that doesn't mean that there was any kind of a finding against the plaintiff. But this does go to kind of a bigger point, which we deal with, which is that when you have someone who's making serious allegations, you have to be really careful, and you have to vet them, and you have to be confident that your client is telling the truth. And I'm not suggesting this person wasn't telling the truth. We obviously have no idea. But even though you have a privilege associated with, you know, drafting pleadings, we are always really careful about making specific allegations against a person based upon something coming from a client. I know that that's something that you think about pretty routinely, right?
Yeah, I mean, in employment cases, or, you know, we have handled some, you know, assault and battery cases in the past. Like, you try to do as much homework as you possibly can and try to have as much tangible evidence as you possibly can to confirm everything that, you know, your client is alleging. But ultimately, some things are he said, she said, and your client's testimony, you know, affidavits, your deposition testimony, your testimony in a trial, that's all evidence that a jury is entitled to believe. So if we do have pleadings that are based on our client's version of things, and it's really just a credibility determination on their part, there are ways that you can have, you know, your client verify their complaints, sort of under penalty of perjury. And I do typically do that in those types of situations, because I think, it's good to have your client sort of be willing to stand by their allegations that they're making. And, we take that seriously to make, serious allegations against somebody. That's not something that, we would take lightly. I guess, the risk to Jay-Z and anybody pursuing a defamation claim, you got to be very confident in your innocence, because truth is a defense to defamation. And sometimes I feel like we go back to this a lot, like the Johnny Depp trial. I mean, he ultimately prevailed in that, but that was a defamation case and all your dirty laundry gets aired. So there's always a risk, and moving forward in these situations. I mean, he's suing the lawyer, not the accuser. This lawyer seems like another, we've been talking about this with Justin Baldoni, like another one of these over the top kind of wants to be a celebrity, maybe towing the line of ethics kind of attorneys. So maybe they feel pretty confident that he's going to look bad. My understanding is that, so California, the defamation cases in California, and they have an anti-SLAPP statute. So SLAPP is strategic lawsuits against public participation, and a lot of states have laws against those because people use defamation cases as a tactic to silence people, and there's a lot of abuse that can be had with these types of claims, especially when the person pursuing the defamation case has kind of unlimited financial resources. So apparently this case kind of got over that hurdle, where Jay-Z will be allowed to continue pursuing, this case. And it sounds like the judge made kind of a finding that, this case was not barred by California's anti-SLAPP statute.
This case is going to be interesting to follow, because I think your point was right. This, the attorney Busby does not seem like someone who's going to back down on this, and Jay-Z clearly is not going to back down. So this is probably going to get pretty ugly. I'm going to we'll follow it, and we'll talk about it as it progresses. It looks like the next, there's some hearings coming up later in February, or well, February is basically over, but I guess in the next couple of months. So. In March, it looks like. So we'll check back in on this. It's interesting, and another example of celebrities blowing up publicly in these legal proceedings. So all right, anything else on that? We'll move on.
Yeah.
Okay. Meta, tell me what's going on with Meta. There's lots going on with Meta always, but as it relates to the legal world, what's happening with Meta?
So I think Meta is being sued in multiple different lawsuits, but one that is currently in the news that's sort of in our wheelhouse is a sex discrimination retaliation lawsuit by one of their former female employees. And I think what's sort of pertinent for our purposes of the podcast is, this is coming on the heels of Mark Zuckerberg doing an interview with Joe Rogan, where he's kind of talking about how he thinks the tech industry has been kind of neutered and needs more masculine energy. My understanding, not being in that industry, is that it's still very heavily male dominated. So I'm not quite sure if that's an actual issue or not within that industry, or if it's just kind of, we all know that there's like this perpetuation going on out there, that a lot of, these kind of what people consider to be like quote unquote woke issues. I think there's a perpetuation of the idea that this is more of an issue than it really is in reality. Still seems to be a pretty male dominated industry, even if, he's saying they need more masculine energy. But it's kind of coming on the heels of that and using that as an example of like no, actually, you're discriminating against women, and your statements just sort of support that.
Yeah, she's alleging some pretty serious problems. I mean, she's saying there was sexual assault. There was a pattern of being passed over for promotions. She was telling me that she says, the boss, whether it was the boss assaulting me or telling me that I needed to have sex with him in order to get a promotion, or telling me I couldn't be recognized because of the ways it would negatively impact a male VP who had made a mistake. Those are direct quotes from her. And according to the article I'm seeing, there are other employees who have made similar allegations. And so, those are not generic benign allegations. Those are serious sexual harassment and discrimination allegations. And, I don't know whether they're true or not. That will play out in the court process. But your point is exactly right, which is, when a CEO of a company goes out and makes these kind of like blanket comments about masculine energy, it's just not helping his cause in potentially trying to defend these claims. It's, part of what the plaintiff will establish or try to establish is this culture at the company of hostility towards women in these roles, which is what she's alleging. And when he comes out and says this, and there's a clear sort of hostility towards it, that's problematic, and that will be used against them. So, am I right on that? I feel like I'm right on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I actually listened to his quote, and I'm not like necessarily defending him. I mean, I think there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of rhetoric out there right now that is just kind of like too much. I think the full context of his quote was sort of what maybe a lot of people sort of agree with, which is like, did the pendulum go too far in one direction and now it kind of has to like come back and settle somewhere in the middle? Maybe. I think that was kind of what he was saying. That being said, I mean, I think anybody who's the boss of a company sort of has to be cautious about what am I saying and what's going to be put in quotation marks and what could be evidence of discrimination. And I think that this is also in the context of Meta, like got rid of all their DEI programs. And that's another, thing that has become a big sort of talking point. When you take that together, when you say, okay, they got rid of their DEI programs, now we're going on podcasts and we're talking about masculine energy and we're doing this and we're doing that, then you're going to have to start looking also at, okay, well, what is like actually happening in the company? So are we laying off a bunch of women? Are we not promoting women? All of those things taken together is what a lawyer is going to use to paint the picture of discrimination. And that's why I think it's, private employers should be cautious to not fall into this rhetoric, because I would not be surprised if we start to see that publicly getting rid of all your DEI programs and being really loud about it because maybe you're trying to like cozy up to the president, or you're like Mark Zuckerberg, I feel like is trying to be like cool, like he's like trying to be cool, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna like cozy up to this like certain types of men and I'm gonna get rid of DEI. And it's like, well, like maybe this is now gonna be a problem somewhere down the line. Like, I don't know. I could definitely see some of these lawsuits shaking out and using getting rid of these types of programs as proof of discrimination. They've been told like these programs are discriminatory. I could see it flipping back the other way where, so now we're going to go back to, whatever was happening before.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a pushback in the tech sector, in the private tech sector, against what I think they seem to believe was an overextension of these DEI policies, which I think we'll talk about some on another episode. But so I think you're right, and I'm not saying they're wrong. I don't work in that sector. Maybe they are right. But to your point, I think it's interesting with Zuckerberg, because he's typically someone who's very cautious with his words. And I think you're right. There's probably more nuance to his statement. I'm sure there is. He's a smart guy. But there's a bit of him that does seem like he's trying to be a little bit Elon Muskish. And maybe just say the brash thing a little bit more, which, as you said, I mean, that's all well and good. Masculine energy, fine. Pushback on DEI, fine. Sexual assault or telling someone they have to sleep with you, that's not fine. He knows that.
Right.
Maybe
And
part
on
of
a
it
case
is,
by case, basis, anytime somebody, goes into a lawsuit, it's really an individualized kind of thing. So, whatever her particular experience is what's relevant. I mean, obviously, like, and that when you ask for sort of sexual favors in return for a promotion, that's what, we call that quid pro quo, sexual harassment. Yeah, I mean, that's really bad. The stuff she's talking about is bad. And then it's just gonna, and then whatever he goes and says publicly and on podcasts and things like that is just gonna be sort of extra that will kind of frame, her story of what it's like to work there as a woman.
then again, Meta made their net income was $20.8 billion last quarter. And financially this will do nothing to them. So, I mean, it's obviously not great PR, but very practically, even if she wins this lawsuit, from their perspective, I guess it's a drop in the bucket, which, not great. Anything else on that one?
No, I mean, I think, like we said, we probably talk about some of this DEI stuff, like, later. I think it's a little bit, I think, of kind of a boogeyman that's been at the moment, and maybe not quite of a good understanding of what was really meant by that and what it was sort of intended to do, which I think it was just to give opportunity to people who did not have it typically.
Yeah, I mean, I from a legal perspective, I think it'll be interesting. I think it's probably a longer conversation. But yeah, we'll revisit it certainly. All right. Onto what I think is the misleading headline of the week because it doesn't give any context. There were multiple articles this week about Rudy Giuliani, for New York City's mayor, his former mayor, who was hit with a $148 million verdict and judgment by two Georgia election workers. I think the verdict came down maybe last year, but basically they accused him of defamation once again, by falsely claiming that they helped to steal the 2020 presidential election. So we're still talking about this. Great. Anyway, Giuliani had
I
$148
just want
million.
to interject and say that it was really sort of serious and egregious what happened to those women. Like, they got death threats, they lost their businesses. It was they really got the brunt of sort of trolls on social media, and it was pretty gross how these just sort of regular people were targeted. I think these were two Black women. There was absolutely zero evidence that they did anything wrong. And again, like we talked about earlier in the episode, truth is a defense to defamation. So if Rudy Giuliani had his proof that the election was stolen and that they did anything untoward in Georgia, he's not the only lawyer who went down in Georgia either, then that would have been a wonderful opportunity to show the whole country your evidence, which did not exist.
There was none.
Which is
Yeah,
why he got a $100 million plus verdict against him.
Well, so what's interesting is the articles say that he has satisfied the judgment. So the way that this works is when you get a judgment against someone, you file it with your local county clerk, and then you have to collect it. So when someone pays the judgment in full or in part, and you are satisfied with it, you can then file what's known as a satisfaction of judgment, which says this judgment has been taken care of, and we're no longer seeking to pursue anything on it. In this case, Giuliani had previously claimed that he was cash poor. There's a comment he made where he said he couldn't even afford to pay for a taxi. Keeping in mind the fact that I think he has apartments in New York City, Florida, probably somewhere else. Apparently, he also was trying to um, avoid having to get rid of his or sell. He has 2 World Series rings that were given to him by the Yankees when he was mayor. So long story short, apparently he worked out a deal where he got to keep his apartment in Manhattan, his condo in Palm Beach, and his World Series rings. And he has promised not to defame these folks again. Given that we haven't heard from him in a while, I guess that promise is okay. I wouldn't trust it. But long story short, this is misleading to the extent that we don't know what he actually paid. I don't know if Rudy Giuliani had $148 million. Nobody does. He probably came up with something that satisfied these plaintiffs that, this is all he can do and we want this to go away and end. And they, in all likelihood, my guess would be that they accepted something less than the $148 million. Because given his prior statements, the only way he could have come up with that is if he had a financial backer who just agreed to pay it. I suppose that's possible, but in all likelihood, there was some compromise which led to, this being satisfied, this being done and over with, and now these people can hopefully go about their lives, and hopefully the harassment has stopped. I'm sure people have moved on to other things to harass people about. So yeah, that's the misleading-ish headline of the week. Any thoughts on that? Comments?
No, I mean, I hope he gave them a lot of money because they deserve it.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine like you're doing your job, like your regular, like state, job, normal, regular human being, like, and then this happens. It's pretty disturbing, these, death threats, and they kind of unleashed a mob on people with no grounds. And I'm glad that even though people continue to believe this, at least these 2 people got some recourse for the damage that those lies did to them.
Yeah, really terrible on a number of levels. All right, so we won't belabor that one anymore. Anything else before we wrap for the week?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Thank you for listening. We'll be back again soon, talking about some new cases in the headlines. We'll be revisiting, I'm sure, some of the cases we've been talking about. But as always, if you have questions, feel free to hit us up on Instagram. And again, if you enjoy the show, please subscribe, like, and leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.